the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we want to briefly mention we do have a Patreon account that can be located at www.patreon.com/MUHH. We have made it so that joining our Discord server is an automatic benefit to patrons. Taylor's leading reading groups, and we're trying to keep that place more active and offer that benefit to patrons. So consider that if you're enjoying the show. Either way, no matter what, we are just appreciative that everyone is enjoying the show. I think everyone's going to be excited about today's episode because we're going to be having a look at Deleuze and Guattari's seminal sequel to Anti-Oedipus, Thousand Plateaus. We'll specifically be diving into the first two chapters, the first two plateaus, introduction, Rhizome, and 1914, One or Several Wolves. So, long journey, but here we are to start off our deep dive into 1,000 Plateaus.
Yeah, as you mentioned, we've done Anti-Oedipus. That was a couple of years ago, right? So,
Aye.
And we have, as I mentioned last time, I guess no, that was at the centenary. Maybe I don't remember. We have you have at least read one of these plateaus when we had Eugene Holland last time.
Yeah, I think I've read multiple, but I'd never cover to cover.
Yeah, and they even say in the introduction, like the plateaus are meant to be, they're unlike chapters that have like beginning and end points. They kind of want to cultivate the rhizomatic aspect of the book, so you can pick it up anywhere. You don't have to read it in order.
Absolutely, a big focus of chapter one. I will say stylistically, like this reads a lot more. I don't know, like there's an artistic, there's a literary sort of approach to the prose, which is not quite. I think Anti-Oedipus seems a lot more technical looking back, but I don't know, maybe that's just a fantasy of my or that's just a particle bouncing around my unconscious.
Yeah, Anti-Oedipus, they draw upon literature a lot, but you can't say that it has a literary form.
Right. Whereas this, I don't know, to me, this struck me as like I could kind of get the vibes that they were going to, or the overall vibe of what was going on, but I couldn't really, I don't know that I could explain what I read that well, if that makes sense. So
yeah, I mean, we
perfect. Luckily I have you, but you're the perfect person to talk to.
We can definitely try to walk through some of the stuff in Rhizome. And I actually think it's even though they throw a lot at us, I think the main points that we could take away, even though that's unfair to the Rhizome to find main points, but some of the big takeaways we could do. That way we can at least do a little bit on, even if we give less time to it, we can do a little bit on Plateau 2. As you remember, we've done 3 episodes on the Wolfman.
Yeah. Well, I liked Rhizome. Plateau 2 a lot better, I think.
Yeah.
Or it was more interesting to me, I think.
You remember we did 2 episodes on the Wolfman, and then we did an episode on Abraham and Torok's book on the Wolfman's. It's like cryptonomy. Is that what the book's called?
Yeah.
And so we've talked about the Wolfman a lot, and so you were at least, and then of course we've talked about Freud a lot, and so I think that you were able to come to the second plateau armed with a little bit more knowledge. Although going into the first plateau, besides a little bit of the knowledge that you and I have gotten from reading together, like Bergsonism, where he does spend time talking about, for example, the three figures I think of, and we've talked about two of them. We would need a mathematician to talk about one, but we talked about Bertrand Russell with Eugene Holland, where Bertrand Russell distinguishes between quantitative and qualitative multiplicities, right? Which is why there's a difference between certain types of extensive magnitudes versus certain types of intensive magnitudes. Now, distance, as weird as that is an intensive magnitude, but I like to think of it more like we talked about with Eugene, where in terms of height, or in terms of like when we're measuring height, falling from 5 feet and falling from 10 feet isn't merely adding those two together. There is a kind of, it has its own, it can't be extensively cut up in the same way, right? So just as walking that first mile and walking that 10th mile feels a lot longer. There's an intensive difference that can't be reduced to basic forms of measurement. And so Bertrand Russell distinguished between quantitative and qualitative. Bergson follows that, but he would also call it, the quantitative would be homogeneous, whereas the qualitative would be heterogeneous. And that's why he divides it up in terms of space. For him, space is homogeneous. True heterogeneity only comes about when we look at duration, what he calls durée, which again, I've told you about this. Duration's is not a good translation of it, because we tend to think of duration as measurable as a unit of measure, as a unity, whereas it's a heterogeneous reality. And then of course,
I think the phenomenological element sounds like, phenomenologically speaking, right? The experience of falling is a subjective, right? It's not something that can be quantified per se. It can to some degree, but like, I don't know. It doesn't have a consistency the way that, I don't know, something else like distance might have a consistency. But then again, I don't know. The experience example you gave, like the 10th mile feeling more difficult, points to phenomenological
lived experience.
Right.
Yeah. And then I guess the last but not least, obviously we've talked a little bit with Dan Smith about this, but it comes from Riemann, right? This question of what he calls manifolds, which is a kind of non-Euclidean topological distinction, and that's originally what the word multiplicity is translating. Riemann doesn't show up immediately in his, maybe he shows up in passing in the Bergsonism book. I don't remember. Deleuze obviously refers to Riemann here and there in some interviews and makes it clear where multiplicity comes from when he talks about it as a substantive. But when he discusses it in this plateau, the introduction, which I saw referred to as like one last kind of, if you will, one last little like homage or tribute to the root book form, right? To have an introduction, even to call the Rhizome Plateau an introduction seems like it goes against the principle, right? As I said, chapters have beginning and endpoints. In any case,
You have to start somewhere.
Yeah. So
Doesn't mean it's the beginning necessarily. I don't know.
Yeah, and you're right. For a certain, even the first paragraph begins in the middle because it's already referring to their conjoint work in Anti-Oedipus and the minor literature Kafka book, right? And I do think that. So one of the things, manifold, multiplicity, with its different. I think Bergson it takes precedent over Riemann here only because one of the things that Deleuze, one of his refrains, is that in terms of the rhizome, in terms of the way of thinking about these heterogeneous multiplicities, when we think about it, it's insofar as we're thinking about intensities and the intensive register, it can't merely be calculated or measured in the way that extensive magnitudes can, right? So that the dimensions change along with the multiplicity, where what he wants to call it changes in kind. Even if we might measure something like temperature according to degree, right? This is the other thing we could use. Or we could use the examples I gave about height or that last mile. The multiplicity changes. Even if we measure it by degrees, it changes in kind in a certain way, right? Because again, the feeling of 50 degrees and the feeling of 100 degrees, it's not necessarily able to be, right? It doesn't make sense to say that, well, just divide the feeling of 100 degrees by 2, by a factor of 2. No, the multiplicity obviously changes. And so I think that's one aspect. And I do, right? So, I mean, like, maybe we should talk about the 6 principles before I even go into more about multiplicity. But that I think that multiplicity in that heterogeneous intensive sense is one way of getting at rhizome. It's not the only aspect, but it's one that we definitely see. And I think it labeled as principle 3. Yeah, it is. But the first 2 are connection and heterogeneity. Right. So one of the things that we hear about the rhizome, as opposed to the tree or the classical image of hierarchy, is that any point of the rhizome can and has to be connected to any other, which definitely makes its connectivity and its dimensions much stranger than we might think of. Again, a kind of non-Euclidean topology, right? If, like, triangles, for example, are the most eminently, like, geometrical shape, it's, or like the Oedipal triangle, right? It's a way of reducing multiplicities down to the simplest type of bodies, to reducing connections, which is why they want to say that, these, that's why tracings or these other forms of power takeovers, as they call it, by the signifier, by subjectification, by stratification, their way of blocking the multiplicity of connections.
So when I make a meme and it's the domino meme and I label the very first block Elon Musk having a harsh and demanding father, and the last domino being now Elon's failure to exit Oedipus is our collective issue, I am being reductive by, right? Like,
But
I don't know. Maybe that's just as an example, right? Like, that's kind of a fun example. Maybe, I don't know.
I mean, isn't that kind of how memes work, though? Right?
Sure.
to a certain extent, they're already a bit of a tracing, right? We have meme templates, right?
Sure. Yeah.
They already function in the format of slotting in things. And so, yeah, they're going to work that way. But that's also why they can propagate so quickly.
Yeah. I mean, Oedipus
Right.
as a meme itself that's a really, I can't believe we've not really hit on that ever. That seems
Yeah.
pretty like elementary.
Yes, as a universal. I know that meme is a form of universal, but as a type of psychogenetic universal for Freud was looking for it's kind of like, that quasi mystical idea of either a great unified theory in mathematics or like one equation, right, that would explain all phenomena. Oedipus is that equation. And so, yeah, it has, any universal is going to have that type of the meme is cool, right? Because it takes a universal format, but it's able to particularize it. And yet it's able to have variables that can be slotted in. So it's a type of structure that's that it mobilizes images and sort of molar entities in ways that makes it easily graspable and like an image, right? Although there are memes that use lots of text and they require a little bit more time to sink in, and maybe also blunt some of their impact too, because most memes are crisp, right? Almost elegant in their simplicity.
Right. Yeah.
Like the example you gave, however funny or not funny it was, but that image of the domino effect as a meme format is very powerful, and you don't need many words. But it's also very topical, right? It's very related to a certain crystallized moment of time, so that they probably also don't age very well, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah. That's a good point too.
Depending on the topic, maybe some age better than others, right? If it's a more specifically kind of cultural trend or fashion that or sort of or if it's more of an esoteric internet thing, like, depending on how general you're able to get, it's kind of like questions of focus and contrast and clarity. But yeah, connection and heterogeneity. I think that one of the examples they give is language, right? Where even, I know they talk about Chomsky here, and they mention Weinreich. Even Saussure wants to say to study language, because in French he makes the distinction between parole, langage. That's not important for us right now, but he will acknowledge very clearly in the sort of opening of his course on linguistics, look, speech is a heterogeneous reality, but to have a scientifically manipulable sort of topic, it has to be delimited and almost reduced to a certain way to a homogeneous totality that we can extract functions and perform certain universal moves. For them, that's obviously what I was mentioning. That's a kind of political maneuver to, for example, to leave aside all things. I mean, for them, language is essentially heterogeneous. And so if you're going to reduce language to the play of the signifier and the signified, you're really not treating language as a map, or you're not mapping the dimensions of language. You're extracting. You're doing a kind of freeze frame or snapshot. That might recall some of our discussions about Bergson, right? One of the reasons why he's and perhaps maybe a little bit technophobic or outdated, but he's wary or suspicious of the cinema, right? Because of the way that it technologically functions. Whereas obviously Deleuze, and he's as Bergsonian as one could get, devotes 2 books to cinema and is able to see beyond that. Probably a difference in generations too.
Yeah.
But in any case,
I mean, I was before you go on, I was thinking about cinema lending itself to a rhizome more readily, I think, just because it doesn't have the same physical constraints of a book of literature, right? Like, and then if you fast forward to something like, I think really the early internet, before platforms really came to dominate the landscape, right? Like you can really see the rhizome there, right? There's linkages to treat, like there are some, like, you know, you have Yahoo and AOL and all these other kind of like typical hierarchical tree structures, but then you have like GeoCities where anybody could go in and like make their own little webpage about whatever topic. I mean, that example is one I think that lends itself to a lot of different things in regard to at least the rhizome chapter, specifically, in the sense of like, not only does it kind of really exemplify how very quick and dirty, like what the rhizome could be, and like how to conceive of it from a visual standpoint even, or like an experiential standpoint of multiplicities of connections, and there's weaving in and out, and there's no center to the internet, right? There's no one quadrant where it emanates from. Like it is heterogeneous in that sense.
think of the image of the web, right? I mean, essentially, we may still use that notion of web, but you're right. There is a way in which today the internet is much more centralized.
Yeah. It's like the reterritorialization process too, which they talk a little bit about, I think,
they'll go into that more in the book for sure.
But they mentioned it briefly, at least. I think
they're already throwing those terms at us. You know, they're already throwing those terms.
Because they're speaking of relative deterritorialization. I mean, you can see that process played out in the way that, you know, I've mentioned this certainly before about the way that, like the digital commons, let's say, are being recolonized, or, you know, the walled gardens are going up, like the property is like, things are being territorialized in a way that they weren't, even despite, like, right, we did, like I said, there were certain tree-like structures of Yahoo, AOL, etc. But now, like, really all of the flows are really crunched down to these very specific websites a lot more. There's not as much openness and free flow, which kind of mirrors just the way that capital accumulation and so forth works relative to information. So
we see that one of the principles of connection and heterogeneity is another word they could use is singularization, but that's implied because what we are, I think that what's interesting is, and this is where they say, especially in part 3 or in principle 3 of multiplicity, and this gets to some of what I was saying earlier, an assemblage is precisely this increase in the dimensions of a multiplicity that necessarily changes in nature or changes in kind, as I was saying, as it expands its connections. What I think is interesting is at the bottom of this is page 8. Unity always operates in an empty dimension supplementary to that of the system considered, and they say overcoding. The point is that a rhizome or multiplicity never allows itself to be overcoded, never has available a supplementary dimension over and above its number of lines. All multiplicities are flat in the sense that they fill or occupy all of their dimensions, and this is where they bring up the plane of consistency, which again we'll get to later. There's no reason to really even unpack some of these terms yet, but we will as we get along in the book. But I do think that this goes back to sort of what I've been saying to you in the past few weeks, maybe not on the episodes, but they want to subtract the one. And as I was saying, like in logic of sense, it's very clear that the one would be the world, self, or God, all three of which sort of are the classical images of what are going to for here they're talking when they talk about in the opening pages.
Yeah, it's like book, author. I forget what the
root
third
book,
one is.
You could do author of creation as God, but author could potentially be self as well. But the self we could even say is they say a book has no object or subject, right? So the book has I think that for them, they want to substitute a becoming world, which they do use that phrase, although it's not one of the main becomings they're going to usually talk about. But when they talk about worlds, they want to talk about the creation of a new world or for people to come and all of these other things, right? These aren't like ready-made out there to be found. This is why in Plateau 3, which is geology of morals, who does the earth think it is, right? We might get into other dimensions of the world and other strata, but I do think that they want to see the rhizome. And this gets to when they bring up Rosenthal and Petitot, the mathematicians. They talk about, I don't remember this, they talk about centered multiplicities and acentered multiplicities, or like the army without a general. That's subtracting some sort of over coding or overarching unifying principle. And in psychoanalysis, it could be the father as the linchpin of Oedipus, right?
But
in
then
any case, yeah.
Well, I mean, I was just going to mention briefly. Maybe this is dumb, and I'll cut it out, but I'll mention it nevertheless. That Mel Gibson was like, "Oh yeah,
I remember, yeah."
I think we might have mentioned this even in the past. I think he said something similar in the past, but something along the lines.
He's not the first person to say this shit about
Daddy's. Yeah. What do you say? Daddy's back, and he's got a belt or something.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's. I swear to God, Freud is fucking rolling his eye. His eyes have rolled out of his head over the last few months at some of these people.
It's very much to a typical refrain in religious discourse. I'm thinking of like sinners in the hand of an angry God. The return of
punish
Christ.
Me, Daddy.
Like God, Christ returns, but he's pissed off. Right?
It's the most fucking I don't know, it's just juvenile. I don't know. It's so. I don't even know what the right word I'm looking for is, but it's just such a bizarre. I don't know. I don't even know how to I'll cut this out because I don't know how to express what I'm even thinking.
Well,
so please move on.
I mean, it does fit into. Do we work with when they want to think of multiplicity rhizome as filling in dimensions? And if you remember, they make this interesting point about Kant. They give Kant credit in the opening of Anti-Oedipus a few times. One for making desire produces object, even though he falls back into a psychological reading where it's wishing and whimsy and fancy. But the other thing they do is that when Kant is writing about introducing negative magnitudes into philosophy, he has a theory of space where it's filled to various degrees intensively. And they say this is a very kind of schizoid theory of matter. And so I do think that when we think about what they said, where they said multiplicities are flat in the sense that they fill or occupy all of their dimensions, it resonates a little bit with that schizoid theory of matter, of filling matter to various degrees. And I guess I would say, when they're talking about the root or the hierarchical image of thought, they are thinking about that even if you do take this to n dimensions, it's always a plus one. It's always n plus one, where the one of unity is the one of the angry god or daddy, whatever it is, right? Assures order, right? Because that's basically what's beyond the weird fantasy implications. Sure, that's maybe what you can't deal with, but what they're thinking of, you need the one, you need the phallus, the father figure, be it Trump or whoever, to assure some sort of order and unity. And for them, that is obviously an old and tired thought. It's and potentially fascicizing. Like, maybe that goes without saying, but we will see that fascism has its own analysis that doesn't necessarily have to do with this supplementary dimension. But we do remember from Anti-Oedipus that the Urstadt and the despotic regime, or the despotic machine, functions by way of overcoding, right? The body of the organs of the sovereign is that supplementary dimension. So it's interesting that
I mean, it definitely goes to our oft stated thing about fascism being desired, right?
Yeah,
like the Reichian theorem, I'll call it.
Well, and how does fascism, and when they turn to look at, for example, like Little Hans or even the Wolfman, Freud thinks he's cured the Wolfman when the Wolfman desires the sort of repression of his own desire, right? When he desires shame and guilt, and when he desires seeing his name sort of reduced from the pack to the wolf being the father, right? So, like, you're right. There is a sense in which desiring one's own subjugation is a part of this. Now, in any case, for them, and this is very important as we go on, because we are talking about these different multiplicities, the heterogeneous ones, which function by way of n-1 in the rhizomatic model, which I shouldn't even use the word model, because to a certain extent, the rhizome, like in Deleuze's discussions of simulacra, it questions the copy and the model distinction. Even though he's not using that language of simulacra anymore, I do think that he's still carrying along that line of thought that he finds in Plato, because in Plato, Deleuze finds the overturning of Platonism in Plato, but it's as a kind of repented thought that's pushed away and brought up just to be rejected. But in Plato, obviously, you've got the archetypes that function as the model, and anything actual in the world is just a sort of reproduction or copy of that, which goes back to the tracing method, right? Whereas the other example would be a sort of wild becoming of simulacra that overturns both the model and the copy, rendering them indistinct. And that's what Plato can't abide. There has to be a kind of, to a certain extent, that's the realm of the sophist. If we think about the types of humans that are vying to be the, let's say, the shepherds of the city, sophist would be the worst, because he renders the model of upright and good thinking. He overturns it. Truth, for example, right? Badiou famously said, like, there's no difference between the philosopher and the sophist, except that the philosopher wagers or takes a stand on truth. This is one of the reasons why Deleuze, you don't hear him talking about truth very much. He's not one of those kind of thinkers. He's not a, when truth gets discussed, it's in the Nietzschean vein of who wants truth. This is what we saw in our discussion of the method of dramatization, right? Do you remember when his professor Alquier was pushing back Adam's like, you finally brought up a philosophical example of truth,
Yeah.
and you're gonna ask about the jealous man, like, and for Deleuze, that just shows a kind of, I think, again, that's a generational break. That's the move away from these classical traditional problems. But in any case, I do think that it's important to note that there's no. They'll say this, and this is part of the tone of the book, the sobriety, if you will. But they will say, obviously, rhizomes are not, or even maps are not like in simple opposition to trees. A rhizome can always get blocked, right? Form a kind of tree, and vice versa. It's just that for them, it's actually a question of method. I don't know if you remember this, and this gets, maybe I'm jumping up a little bit, but
You
when
got
they
cut off there at the
oppose-
beginning, so I just want to, for the audience, just repeat that a tree, like a rhizome, can get blocked off and become a kind of arboreal tree-like.
Yes,
Just to,
and vice versa, right? The trees can blossom.
yeah,
out
they
and
they say
burgeon
that
out
they
into
have
rhizomes.
anarchical. There are anarchical forms. There's offshoots of the taproot, etc., for the tree, and that the rhizome can develop. I forget exactly what do they say that can like have its own. I'd have to look at the fucking quote. I might delete that out.
That's fine. I mean,
I don't know if you
you
remember
are-
the language they use is very nice and specific about what happens on what the potentialities of the rhizome in a sort of negative light. Like it's not just, I think the point just being like it's not just this, oh, everything's horizontal and great, and like
Mhm.
this kind of dualistic thinking perhaps is the ultimate, which may be more of the one of the latent critiques of the first chapter, or maybe not so latent. I don't know.
Well, it is interesting. We see at the end of the chapter where they're like, aren't we just keeping to bring up these dualisms, like the tree and the rhizome, the map and the tracing, and their first response to this, and they do come back to it later, and this is in that great equation, pluralism equals monism, which we could talk about a little bit, but they say it is a question of method. The tracing, and we could include the tree, the tracing should always be put back onto the map. So we can imagine that the tree should always be put back into the middle in the rhizome. However one wants to do that, one way would be through grafting. If we're going to use botanical procedures. But the one thing that we can see is consistent with the Deleuze we've studied is that the tracing functions on a model of recognition, of resemblance, and not a model of difference, right? Not the model that he's been working on in we even see it in Anti-Oedipus, where the molar domain of Oedipus is all about these, even Girard's mimetic rivalry, right? It's about a domain of representativity. That's Freud's language, even when he describes what the drives do and the components of drives. They are all functioning as psychical representatives, right? And they all are all in this representative domain. And I think that for Deleuze and Guattari, that can't have any grip on the real.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's the difference between extensivity and intensivity again, right? Representation is never on the level of intensity, if that makes sense.
I mean, I was thinking the way that this kind of resembles the meme effectively in the sense of, for Girard, it's not like, even Freud for that matter, it's like the substitution, like any content can be substituted in the whatever, which even goes to like objet off, for example. Any content of desire can become this object of fill in the place holder of the caregiver or the object of desire, right? Like those.
Yeah,
So in that sense, like it's a
substitution is what you're talking about. Yes,
right.
gotcha.
Like the meme has that same sort of property because there's a form. The form itself alone communicates something that can be intensified or de-intensified by the specific content placed within the forms, if that follows. So
Yeah,
I don't know. I just thought about that as an interesting little aside regarding this kind of mimetic nature of Oedipus.
Yeah, I think that there's something we'll have to figure out as we move on.
I mean, even the Platonic the form of the meme itself, like the form has a transcendent element to it, and the way that it's expressed is immanently.
Yeah, it's definitely something that can be manipulated, and I think that it does function well as a tracing, right? It does function well to allow it to enter into variations, but it's I guess that actually does, since we are talking about memes, it does actually bring in, since we have talked about the fifth and sixth, the question of mapping and tracing. The fourth principle is the principle of asignifying rupture. For them, not every trait of the rhizome is going to be linguistic, and even linguistics, we have to, like for Guattari, questions of coding and these other things aren't always linguistic, and the semiotics, the relationship of signs and the study of signs in their generality, much broader than what I mentioned earlier about questions of signifiers and signifieds. They're very hostile to the sort of power takeover by the signifier. And so this is why they bring up the wasp and the orchid. This is what, on page 10? Because there's a way of explaining the wasp and the orchid that could function by mimesis or by some sort of functioning by resemblance. And they want to say instead something else entirely is going on. Not imitation at all, but a capture of code, surplus value of code, an increase in valence, a veritable becoming, a becoming wasp of the orchid, and a becoming orchid of the wasp. And they cite Remy Chauvin, the aparallel evolution of two beings that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. That absolutely nothing to do with each other might be a little too much because they do exist within certain environments and milieus. But I think that if we just are thinking like genetically or on the place of the Carolingian classificatory scale, when we're thinking of plants versus insects, they are far apart in that evolutionary schema. So, for them, it's not about a question of explaining the orchid trying to imitate the wasp. It almost makes it harder to do that, or it leaves a lot begging the question. To state that that's the phenomenon that's going on, and there's a way of saying it that you can reduce it to that, does not at all get to, okay, but how? Like in what ways and in what circumstances does that type of ability develop? And even if we are not necessarily fully given the explanation by their way of saying it. It's not imitation, but it's becoming. At least we aren't led into certain dead ends by then having to continually go back down the path of saying how the orchid developed a manner of imitating the wasp in order to further its reproductive capacities. We open up new problems, and the problems are much more interesting and much more dynamic, and maybe, again, sadly, maybe not as suited to science. They do say that, like, what they're doing isn't necessarily trying to explain what the orchid and the wasp are doing in a scientific manner. That requires a certain other set of criteria and tools, but they at least can, I think, from the philosophical standpoint, point out the limitations to which using resemblance and imitation to explain what's going on probably won't lead science down correct paths, or at least down paths that would be able to go beyond certain let's say, I don't want to say shortcuts, but you know what, at the end of the day, when they call the rhizome an anti-genealogy, I do think it's interesting because we're talking about the reproductive capacities of the orchid. But what we see here, and this is going to be something that we can see, I'm just thinking particular, it's not the only one, but Plateau 10 on becoming intense, becoming animal, when they are going to be talking about how packs, which we get a little bit of in Plateau 2, function by way of alliance. There's a weird type of alliance going on between the wasp and the orchid that can't be. You can't go back to genealogically to the first orchid to. You could theoretically do it in a Darwinian way. There was some sort of weird mutation that the orchid somehow contingently, accidentally is able to benefit from the wasp and therefore further its line. Sure, that's one way of doing it, but it seems as though, again, something is left out and something is still left unexplained about how that is possible. To say, it's one thing to say that offspring had more chances to flourish with that mutation. It's another thing to say how that even is possible, or how that happens in ways that are more interesting, again, than using this question of resemblance and mimesis.
Or even like Oedipally speaking in the sense of the genealogical method too. I mean, I think the example in extremis of the virus maybe yields more like it's a more cogent example of the way that the body without organs works, I think, relative to, I mean, I guess they don't really say body without organs at that point, but that's kind of what this is gesturing at, right? And I think in Proust and Signs, Deleuze uses the spider and the spider web example.
That's right. Yeah.
There's something easier, I think, to grasp about it with respect to the virus, because the virus is already like so sort of an abstract machine in its own right, or something. I'm fucking it up by using abstract machine, so maybe we should call it something else, but it does get at the machinic aspect of it, right? Like a virus doesn't have a nucleus. Does it? Does virus have a nucleus, or does it just have genetic code, or is there a distinction between that per se?
Well, I mean,
I'm gonna have to look this up. Let's see what fucking Google says about it.
I mean, depends on what you mean by nucleus. Like atoms have nuclei, so
there's no nucleus in a virus.
But in terms of cells, yeah, that makes
many
sense.
typical cell components like the mitochondria or nuclei, and even the ribosome are
Mm.
absent in viruses. Even some of these viruses are cytoplasm free. Viruses do not contain the organelles that cells do.
There you go. And Guattari is fascinated by. I wouldn't be surprised if he's the one that is interested in this mention of Bonvanese and Totaro's current research on a type C virus with the double connection to baboon DNA and the DNA of certain kinds of domestic cats. I mean, Guattari is very fascinated about like
Yeah, this type
the,
of
the coding possibilities that viruses have and their way of transforming code. Right.
it's kind of a, but it goes to that. I think to that example of uh, the army without a general, like
Yeah.
the subtracted out.
The virus without a nucleus or something is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly right. Like it can follow these like literal lines of flight from one organism to the other, and it has even though it's very simple, like it has like a multiplicity implicit in the way that can adapt to it can adapt and inject code and like etc. It can mimic, it can trace, it can, I don't know.
Yeah.
It can bring things into metastasis or metastability.
Let's see. We've talked in and out of this. They bring up America at the end, which is double edged because it's where the rhizome and the tree kind of enter into reversible aspects. Yeah, I would say that the dualisms things, and maybe this can let us, because I know we'll talk about more about rhizomes as we go through the book, so we don't have to blow our load here. But the thing about pluralism equals monism is that throughout A Thousand Plateaus, and maybe it's not just that, we can see them already doing this somewhat in Anti-Oedipus, but we will see, yes, provisionally certain dualisms are being brought up and worked through, but they're never being used as something to settle on as a foundation. There's a provisional dualism, so there's a provisionally we diverge, and that's to eventually converge. Already this method is in Bergson's book, in the Bergsonism book, where Deleuze talks about the way of identifying badly analyzed problems and mixtures, right? The reason why we diverge is that reality presents us with mixtures, right? We already have to deal with the mixture, whether we want to call it matter or memory, but that's not a bad way of doing it. Recognition is already aiding us in our perception. So reality is what it is, right? We can't do anything about that. But Bergson, and he has this almost fetish for a purity in our faculties, where he wants to diverge the, let's say, psychological aspects of memory from our perceptive faculties, right? But yet to make them converge again after performing that slice. This is also what leads him to focus on time rather than space. Interestingly enough, Deleuze and Guattari, we'll see this in this book, but in other books as well, but especially this book. And as I said, Deleuze is probably one of the, Bergson is, he remains faithful to him in so much, but we will see that even in the title of the book, A Thousand Plateaus, plateaus is a spatial geographical dimension. So is the rhizome. It comes from natural sciences, but we are thinking of it in a spatial, in a certain sense, it has a spatial image as opposed to the tree. We will see that becoming really needs to be understood almost geophilosophically, or it needs to be understood more so in space than in time. becoming isn't necessarily about a time. Just as the middle is a spatial consideration, although it undergoes aspects that, as they say, at the end, the middle is by no means an average. On the contrary, is where things pick up speeds. Between things does not designate a localizable relation going from one thing to the other and back again, but a perpendicular direction, a transversal movement that sweeps one and the other away. A stream without beginning or end that undermines its banks and picks up speed in the middle. That's how they end this chapter or this plateau. But I would say that it's interesting to me that Deleuze doesn't agree with Bergson about privileging time over other dimensions. He definitely gives it consideration, but it's not going to be the main thing. But again, you use dualisms, but in a way that never settles on any of them, and so they kind of are saying they're shuffling through them, but they do mention that dualism is the enemy, right? Is that how they say it? Let me look. Arrive at the magic formula we all seek. Pluralism equals monism via all the dualisms that are the enemy, an entirely necessary enemy, the furniture we are forever rearranging. Yeah, I would just say to that, for them, if we start with a monism, we kind of start with a dogmatism or a type of, even like worse, a type of theological mysticism. You can only arrive at monism after having gone through, or after having started from the middle, if you will, working through these dualisms. This is why it's pluralism equals monism and not the other way around. If you start with monism, you're not going to leave monism. If you start with pluralism, then you can eventually converge. So that's my reading of the formula. But it's the magic formula, but that's my reading of it.
Do you remember? Okay, so we talked about this in the method of drama a little bit, because I was saying it's almost like the reverse. It's like the individuated subject is the past, and the monad is the future, or something like, or the like milieu or whatever is the future. So I don't know if that has any like resonance per se, but it kind of sounded a bit similar in that way. Although time, I can't speak to that.
Yeah, it's I would say, like, for them, I think it's also the fact that it could be easy, for example, to see certain parts of the binaries of the dualism as good and others as bad. As we saw in like Anti-Oedipus, we could say desiring machines are good, right? But we saw that they are in opposition or in conflict with the body without organs that's constantly trying to repel them. So does that mean the body without organs is good? Well, we see in 1,000 Plateaus later, there are also empty body without organs. You can botch it. There are cancerous body without organs.
Right. The rhizome has its own drawbacks, or again, forgive me, but I forgot the specifics. And the arboreal, the tree, has anarchisms within it too. So it's like, I think, not to totalize any particular, like they maybe it would be something like the partiality, right?
The
like there's a partiality to a function, maybe.
Yeah.
But it's not totalizing. It's not written in stone per se that this one function has to be the operation.
Yeah, it's interesting that they will say, even if we never get a sort of purity, everything is kind of de facto mixed. That doesn't mean for them that there aren't de jure specifications. They'll say this in the very last plateau before the conclusion, in the smooth and the striated, where they're like, sure, you could say these are ideal types, the rhizome, the tree, because as we said, they each have they each have the potential to branch out or become blocked. But
Right.
making those distinctions is important. And in any case, yeah, I mean, it's kind of it's kind of the same question of like intensity and extensivity. There's a way in which intensity is always going to be covered over extensively, right? I mean, like even for them, the sub-representative domain of the ideas, it's important to be able to reach it, even if we have to use like words to represent and get there. So like, there's no simple solution to merely doing away with these dualisms, or merely, yes, they say they're sick of trees, right? But to a certain extent, that's hyperbolic kind of humor. I think that the problem is there's a whole tradition in philosophy that only wants to see trees, or only wants to see extensivity, or only wants to see, if the intensive is allowed a certain free reign, it's still subordinated to its extensive forms. The same with difference. Difference is still subordinated to quote unquote the same. So it's a question of trying to fight against that preliminary, pre-given predominance of that side that really goes along with our common perceptions and common sense. But, you know, struggling against that can bring about unexpected possibilities. And that's, I think, why psychoanalysis, this is why they go straight from the rhizome back to psychoanalysis. You would think they might be done with it after Anti-Oedipus, but they go straight back as a way of exemplifying certain aspects. For example, the aspect of multiplicity, right? One or several wolves is already announced in the title. And since you like this one more, do you want to say something about it before we briefly talk about this short plateau?
Sure. Yeah, I think maybe where I would start would be, I sort of get the sense that, or get right, the unconscious as a multiplicity, like that's pretty easy to grasp for me, I think, just in the way that, right, it doesn't, like all of that stuff, it's all of human history in a sense. It's like, so in that sense, I can see the multiple within the unconscious, that whatever flows through the individuated subject. I don't really necessarily understand all the shit that they're talking about as far as the ass of the wolf and the mouth of the wolf, and like these intensive aspects, and like I do get the reduction aspect of like Freud's jamming this into the Oedipus meme, if you will. Like I get that, but I don't really get the significance of what they're saying as far as the wolves and like intensity, how they're linking up to one another, etc.
This is this comes back to Anti-Oedipus again. I'm just looking at page 29. Problems of peopling in the unconscious. All that passes through the pores of the schizo, the veins of the drug addict, swarming, teeming, ferment, intensities, races, and tribes. Freud tried to approach crowd phenomena from the point of view of the unconscious, but he did not see clearly. He did not see that the unconscious itself was fundamentally a crowd. He was myopic and hard of hearing. He mistook crowds for a single person. This is why they turn to that essay of the unconscious, right? Where a sock is a field of multiplicity of stitches. For Freud, it's obvious that the sock as a molar object, it can be taken as a vagina, right? But that's the neurotic point of view. When we look at the sock and see a field of vaginas in the stitches, now we're in psychosis, right? Like there's almost an interesting way that Freud is sensitive without being aware of it to this molar and molecular distinction. The other thing would be that, and this gets to the very end of the chapter, and I'm not trying to move too quickly, but I do think that a lot of this needs to kind of ferment. You need to ruminate, as they say about when Nietzsche talks about his aphorisms, they have to be ruminated. I do think that as we get further along, but they say there are no individual statements, there never are. Every statement is the product of a messianic assemblage, in other words, of collective agents of enunciation. The proper name is the instantaneous apprehension of a multiplicity. The proper name is the subject of a pure infinitive comprehended as such in a field of intensity. And they go on, and this is the last page. We are not just criticizing psychoanalysis for having selected Oedipal statements exclusively, for such statements are, to a certain extent, part of a machinic assemblage. We are criticizing psychoanalysis for having used Oedipal enunciation to make patients believe they would produce individual personal statements and would finally speak in their own name. The trap was set from the start. Never will the wolf man speak. I think that that's part of the tracing elements that we were talking about last time, that for Freud, ultimately, Oedipus as schema, everything is going to be traced from that schema. Everything is going to be triangulated. Mommy, daddy, me, right? Everything is going to be reduced to those vectors, to the family. It functions as a means of psychic repression. It blunts and blocks the rhizome of, because you could make a rhizome of the Wolfman. It would include his displacement from Russia, losing his wealth, the Bolshevik Revolution, the upcoming First World War, which is why this rhizome is dated, or this plateau is dated. It's the first one to be dated, right? The rhizome isn't. Rhizome's just introduction, where a date should be or could be. But 1914 is the date we get for One or Several Wolves, right? The beginning of the First World War. And it's around the time of the Wolfman publication, if I remember. The Wolfman case history that Freud produces. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, there would be no way to... yeah, you can look that up. In a certain sense, okay, there you go. Written at the end of 1914, but not published till 1918. Probably could have been for reasons. It could have been because of the war, but it also could have been for the fact that sometimes he delays publication of case histories because of concerns about concealing information, doctor-patient confidentiality, and all that shit. In any case, there's a sense in which psychoanalysis gets us to speak in, makes us believe we're speaking in our own name when we're speaking in the name of Oedipus, right? Because Oedipus too is a proper name to a certain extent, right? So they're right to say that edible statements too are a part of an assemblage, a certain assemblage, and they have the effect of sort of thinking that we speak in our own names when we are speaking of mommy and daddy. I guess the thing too, that goes back to what you were saying about genealogy, right? There's a sense in which Oedipus is forcing us into a genealogical method rather than a rhizomatic one. We've seen it too. I saw it recently.
Like the originary shit, right?
Got to go back. We gotta, and sometimes, as they will say, as I've seen psychoanalysts say, to explain psychosis, sometimes you need to go back 2-3 generations, right? So you need to go back to great grandma and trace and plot the family tree, place the line of madness down, and track it down to explain it. And some of this stuff is, I've read some of this stuff about intergenerational aspect. I do believe, if you remember, Abraham and Torok did something like this, where they wanted to go back, not just to Pankiev's, the Wolfman's father, but go back to the grandfather, and they were doing some of this genealogical stuff. Ultimately, they remain beholden to the psychoanalytic enterprise, right? Instead of schizoanalysis. Let's be clear. Even if they are very creative and do a very interesting reading of the Wolfman case. But I do think that, the stuff about packs and masses is very important, right? We're going to see more of that, I said, in Plateau 10, but we get some of the stuff about you probably are familiar from Anti-Oedipus. This is page 31. What should have been done is the opposite. All of this should be understood in intensity. The wolf is the pack. In other words, the multiplicity instantaneously apprehended as such insofar as it approaches or moves away from zero, each distance being non-decomposable. Zero is the body without organs of the wolfman. If the unconscious knows nothing of negation, that's one of the Freud tenets we've always talked about, is because there is nothing negative in the unconscious, only indefinite moves toward and away from zero, which does not at all express lack, but rather the positivity of the full body as support and prop. And here they actually quote Klosowski. This is a quote again from the opening of Anti-Oedipus, probably the first 20 pages or so. Quote, "For an afflux is necessary simply to signify the absence of intensity." It's interesting they don't cite him. The wolves designate an intensity, a band of intensity, a threshold of intensity on the wolfman's body without organs. This is why you brought up the jaw and the ass.
Think about this as far as there's no negative in the unconscious. So even through repression, which we would kind of like commonly understand as a sort of negative for pressure on the latent content of the unconscious, what happens is the unconscious produces a anti-cathexis to negate and keep the latent content repelled. So just to kind of think through, like, what does it mean that there's nothing lacking in the unconscious, or there's nothing negative in the unconscious? Like an example of how that, perhaps what that looks like and why they say that, right? That's kind of what I was trying to sort of understand relative to that statement, at least.
Well, a lot of things that we associate with absence or lack would, they, in terms of the unconscious, it just doesn't work that way, right? I mean, death doesn't work that way. This is why the death of God, when we've talked about it with Nietzsche, is important, because it just doesn't. It's not something that matters at the level of the unconscious. Death is not an absence in that sense. Or the passing of time is another thing that Freud says the unconscious doesn't know about. To a certain extent, the passing of time would have to provisionally be able to, even if we go so far as Bergson to say that the past kind of coextends or coexists with the present, there would need to be some sort of lack and absence to be able to situate a kind of linear arrow that would make sense in that domain. The same as how even the earliest childhood memories can sometimes have much more intensive affect attached to them than more recent ones. So in that sense, even the time healing all wounds may work for consciousness, but not necessarily for the unconscious. And this is why they, in the Rhizome plateau, they distinguish between long-term memory and short-term memory. It's a different regime, and so long-term memory, which is what Freud's going to want to work with, right? He's going to work with those earliest childhood memories and build the tracings from off of that. Everything is going to be traced. If we're not in the domain of Oedipus immediately, we're going to get there through that tracing of the earliest childhood memories. Those are all going to be screens for the Oedipal drama. That we all are mimetically templated into, right? So I do think, and yeah, on page 32 and 33, they actually do go through Riemann, Russell, Bergson. I had forgotten that they do this, but they say, but I'm glad we brought that up and was able to make the connection between the Rhizome chapter and this one by going through that. I won't restate all that stuff, but it's obviously this is where they're distinguishing the macro and the micro, or the molar and the molecular. To a certain extent, they will even push back on merely seeing the molecular as micro, but that's not as important right now. Yeah, I suppose this question of speaking in one's own name, that still, again, some of the stuff they're saying here about the proper name is really going to make sense, I think, a little bit later, because for Deleuze and Guattari, the proper name is not a question of designating objects or even persons under it, right? That's still too extensive, and that's what Freud is able to do with the Oedipal apparatus. It's the fact that proper names designate events, anxieties, becomings, fields of intensity. We've seen them say something similar to this in Anti-Oedipus when they talk about when they describe how in science there's an interesting use of the notion of effect. I'm trying to think of off the top of my head what's an effect, like the Doppler effect. So that's one that I'm thinking of, but it's the way that they use the way, and they give, I think for them, they say meteorologists and like army leaders when they name like quote unquote operations, right? Certain types of battle formations or certain type of incursions, that for them is closer to what they mean by events, by proper names as events. So why do we name hurricanes? I mean, like, to a certain extent, yes, maybe it's a conventional thing and maybe a coincidence, but the proper name given to a hurricane is important, right? It is a field of a complex field of effects that not only involves these different regimes of intensity interacting and crossing certain thresholds in order to take on the consistency of a hexaity, of a singularity, but it also sweeps into play all kinds of other individuals outside of what we might consider as its proper name, because it's not just those physical forces coalescing to create a sort of yes, it is a non-human formation, but it has effects that are very much considered in terms of human interactivity. So the proper name is a field of vectors and an event. This is why they want to see effects in history. They say they mention like a Joan of Arc effect. This was kind of an interesting thing. Again, not using science in an inexact way. They're taking a movement in science and applying it outside of its immediate field of apprehension for unexpected consequences. I do think that if we the next time we do 1,000 Plateaus, we'll probably want to only spend time on the geology of morals. It's 36 pages, but they are definitely dense. We'll have to dig through the earth.
Pretty sure I've read that one before, maybe.
Yeah,
I'm just thinking of the Nietzsche title, Inspiration.
Mm-hmm, yep. Yeah, so we'll get to. I think that this one is very essential for making sense of some of the language in the rest of the book.
Gotcha.
And then 4 and 5 pair pretty nicely because it's linguistics and then several regimes of signs. Although we'll have to see, that still might be a lot, but they do pair well. Some of these are shorter until we get to 10, 11, and 12. But in any case, yeah. Are
you thinking you wanted to wrap up there? Or did
I just, yeah, I guess I would let you say anything else if you wanted to, but we got started, and I feel like we'll build up momentum as we get to the middle. Right? We'll gather speed as we get further in.
Yeah. What do you make of this phrase, thought lags behind nature?
Well,
maybe I should look that up in the text to grab extra context.
It actually reminds me of something that Simondon says, but for Simondon, thought is always kind of lagging behind the sciences. But I do think that there's something about, philosophy is always lagging behind the sciences. But thought lagging behind nature is interesting because they're criticizing that first type of book, the root book, which takes the book to be this image of the world, this natural image, and this natural image of thought, if you will. And it's kind of like the Spinoza's like, we don't know what a body can do. Well, we definitely don't know if nature is considered as the sort of some totality of bodies, including incorporeal instances. If you want to include that, maybe you don't. Maybe that would be a different discussion. But if we are considering bodies alone, still, we don't know what a body can do, let alone the cosmic aggregate of bodies. But in any case, yeah, there is a sense in which, in lagging behind nature, also wanting to imitate nature, right? Imitate the most natural thing in the world, at least from the sort of way in which thought tries to work in its simplicity is the tree. We do see them in the middle of this introduction Rhizome talk about the brain as itself as a rhizome and a multiplicity, and not at all like a tree. And I think that's definitely makes sense. But
yeah, absolutely. I think there was even something else you were discussing that was reminding me of that example too, because of the way the dendrites and the axons and the way the like electrical signal hops between the gaps and so forth. But yeah, so you could see how the brain would be like this heterogeneous thing in itself, and a multiplicity. There's no central. I mean, I guess there's like the lizard, right? There's the amygdala.
Yeah, there's we it's interesting, we date like regions of the brain, right? Like that we're able to like think about the sort of oldest parts of the brain, and that's, I think, on the one hand helpful because obviously some of the more rudimentary means of regulating homeostasis and keeping breathing at a preconscious level and all of this, sure, those are older, but it always feels a little weird to think about, okay, this is the neocortex, and that's the like, I'm sure there's reasons for doing that, but it does feel like kind of like multiplicities. The more connections you make, the multiplicity is changing in kind. So I've always felt it's an interesting but perhaps misleading thing to do, because yes, sure, you have that, you have that stem that's going to be doing some of the most basic functions, vital functions. But again, like as we evolve and as brains evolve, doesn't the brain have to sort of shift itself?
Right. Yeah. It's a deterritorialization in a sense, I would say.
Yeah.
And its subsequent RT, DT and RT. Because yeah, once you incorporate another region of like, yeah, you're no longer dealing with the same. So I like that. It's a good way to couch it.
It's kind of like dividing all of life into different species and genera. Like, yes, it's helpful, but that doesn't really mean that it's more than just an expedient for knowledge.
Yeah, because what was the piece we read from Deleuze that was kind of saying, okay, we should classify animals by their functions more so than by their appearances.
Well, this was something I think that came out, and this is in Geology of Morals, the debate between Cuvier and Saint-Hilaire, when we were talking with Maya and Amy about acute accelerationism. I know we spent a little bit of time talking about the debate between Cuvier and Saint-Hilaire, but it could have been somewhere else too. I don't remember.
Yeah,
it might have been in one of the monographs, and I had forgotten.
I think it might be, but it's somewhat recent. But I can't really point to which specific episode.
Okay. Well, do you want to wrap up for this week, bud?
Yeah, I think we can put a stop to it there. That'll wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. We'll see y'all next week.
The very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people as in Clockwork Orange.